Welcome everyone. Welcome to our podcast Global Focus by Hari Prakash Sinha, where today we unravel a pressing global issues. The US national debt is skyrocketing past 36 trillion and its alarming implication for the global economy, from its ripple effect on developing nations to the potential threat it poses to the dollar's dominance. This is a conversation no one invested in the future of global trade and finance can afford to miss. How does this debt crisis impact your life? We are pleased to have Dr. Adityanjee with us, who will enlighten us on this issue. Dr. Adityanjee is the president of the Council for Strategic Affairs. Let's dive in. Welcome to our podcast, The Global Focus by Hari Prakash Sinha, Dr. Adityanjee.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Sinha, for inviting me on your platform, Global Focus. I just will give a disclaimer. I'm not an economist, but I'll try my best to analyze this particular issue.
Great. So I am moving to my first question to you. What are the primary reasons behind the rapid acceleration of the US national debt, and how sustainable is this trajectory in the long run? So what do you say about it, sir?
The causes of this rising national debt in US are multidimensional, multifold. As you already stated, it is $36 trillion.
Yeah.
So if you look at US GDP, it is only $29 trillion.
Oh.
So debt to GDP ratio is already 125%. And interestingly, now the debt accumulation is almost $2 trillion per year, or maybe even more. Because in January of 2024, the debt was 34 trillion. July, it became 35 trillion.
Oh.
And already in November, it is 36 trillion. So by December 31st, it will be probably more than 30, maybe 37 trillion or something like that. Was it always like that? No, not necessarily. Actually, the rapid accumulation in national debt happened around after 2000, year 2000.
I see.
And it has to do with the wrong policies of the government. Essentially, whenever there has been a recession, the US government has tried to deal with recession by overspending. So you spend your way through recession. That has been the mantra.
Yeah, yeah.
Previously, one of the principles of conservatism was balanced budget.
Mm-hmm.
Now that seems to have been abandoned. We in United States still don't have the annual budget passed because the society and the political parties are so polarized that they cannot even pass the annual budget. So everything is done on an ad hoc basis by continuing resolution. Also take into consideration the number of wars the United States has prosecuted in last 3 decades.
Yeah.
Generally, their rationale is that, well, wars are necessary, wars benefit the military industrial complex. But wars also have a cost.
Yeah.
And when the wars are there, there's no auditing of the costs.
Right.
So there have been, reports that for a simple toilet seat, which you can buy in any store
Mm-hmm.
for maybe $10 or $15,
Yeah.
Pentagon paid $500 to the contractors. So we are talking about that level of waste. And also in the wars, money or cash is used as a lubricant
Mm-hmm.
to buy allegiances. It happened in all the wars in the West Asia. The US response also has been whenever there is a problem, to indulge in something which is called quantitative easing. The Federal Reserve takes a decision and indulges in quantitative easing, which means print more dollars. Dollar is no longer pegged to the gold standard
Mm-hmm.
since mid-70s,
Yeah.
and it's a reserve currency, it's a global currency. So Federal Reserve keeps on printing more dollars into circulation, which of course causes inflationary pressures.
Yeah.
So there are multiple reasons, but in last 8 years actually, the deficit has increased quite a lot, irrespective of which party was in power, which president was there. So during Donald Trump's first term, the national debt got increased by $7.8 trillion dollars. And situation is not so hunky-dory during Biden's time. You look at the, you know, revenues that come and then the spending. 13% of the spending is on interest payments because you have so much of debt that you have to process that debt and pay the interest. So that is 13% of the budget of the spending. 61% of the spending is mandatory. That is the entitlements, things like Social Security, things like Medicare, Medicaid, other federal and state government programs uh, for which there is a budgetary allocation mandated by Congress by law. Once a law is passed, it's very difficult to stop spending in that particular line item. Only around 24 or 26% of the spending is discretionary, which can be controlled. And out of that, around 14% is on defense budget and around 12% on non-defense budget. So if you are going to cut the spending, we are going to cut the spending. You cannot touch the mandatory spending because Congress has already passed the laws. Unfortunately, when the laws are passed, they are passed in good intention, but they are abused like everywhere. There's a culture of freebies everywhere in every democracy. And it does not help that you have congressional elections every 2 years in United States. So in order to get elected, you are going to promise anything. So once a law is passed for a particular benefit, that becomes an entitlement. And we see that the taxes are paid, income taxes, they contribute to the major part of government revenue. So 49% of the government revenue comes from individual income tax. Then there's a payroll tax that is around 36% of the government revenue. Corporate income tax, that pays only 9% of the government revenue. And the indirect taxes like excise duty, customs, uh, all those kind of things constitute only 5% of the government revenue. So in order to have a balanced budget, you can do only two things. You cut down on the spending, or you raise the revenue, or you do both. Okay. Now you cannot cut down the spending because you have mandatory spending. You have to pay Social Security, you have to pay for Medicare, you have to pay for Medicaid, you have to pay for other benefits.
Yeah.
There were some attempts made in 1990s to balance the budget, and at that time it was said that you could not be on welfare forever. You know, welfare will be tested, for employability and all every
Mm.
2 years, and you'll have to go to mandatory training to find a job, etc., etc., skills training. But again, under electoral pressure, that was given up. If you are able to get disability, you are probably lifelong on disability, so the taxpayer is paying for you. If you are on some kind of compensation, employment related injury, you are lifelong on that. With so many wars lead to casualties, they lead to injuries, and war veterans. They are rest of the life on 100% service connected benefits for their war related injuries. And they are also then entitled to social security disability. So you create situations by which your mandatory spending keeps on increasing. And you don't do any kind of means testing that, yes, you were disabled once, but are you disabled forever? Can you take an alternative job? Can you do some skills training? All that goes by wayside. So people have a culture of freebies. Uh, the electoral system does not allow you to curtail the expenses. And it's very difficult to raise the revenue when the economy is going down. And revenue is generated mainly by personal income tax. Nobody wants to pay higher taxes. The corporates have a very special status in United States. Corporations, you know, they maneuver legally to pay minimum amount of taxes. Some of the corporations pay zero taxes. So the federal government's revenue comes only 9% from corporate tax and 5% from indirect taxation. So one way of raising the revenue would be to increase the indirect taxations, things like excise duty, custom duty, or sales tax, or things like that. But there's a limit to how much you can do because indirect taxes disproportionately affect the lower segments of the society. So it's not a very happy situation. And unless very strong fisted measures are taken, this situation is going to continue. And it is going to be bad for US economy because the society is transferring the debts to the future generation. And future generations will have to pay that debt, which is being taken for easy lifestyle, comfortable lifestyle of people at this point in time.
Okay, so that's all about America. How does the growing US national debt impact global financial stability, particularly for developing economies dependent on US monetary policies? So your comment.
Look, US is the largest economy. So if there are headwinds in US economy, there are repercussions. In 2008, 2009, there was a banking crisis in US. It led to downstream consequences for other countries.
Yeah,
It led to a currency crisis in Southeast Asia and, uh, in fact, other countries had to chip in, countries like China that had to help Southeast Asian countries with currency stabilization. So if, and also dollar is a global currency, if dollar loses its value, it will affect the global trade. But US does not decide its monetary policy taking into consideration what is going to happen to developing countries. You know, you need to be very you need to understand that their primary goal is US. They do whatever they want to do to perpetuate their political power, the political parties, the presidential candidates, and all.
yeah.
So they care a hoot about developing countries, and developing countries have to develop their own policies so that eventually whatever happens in the United States does not affect the national economies of other countries. And I'm pretty sure that smarter countries will try to quote unquote de-risk their economies from US economy. In recent years, last 2 years, in Europe and United States, there have been two terms coined: decoupling from Chinese economy and de-risking from Chinese economy, because China was adopting predatory mercantile trade practices. So these terms were coined, which meant that you are not going to be so much integrated in supply chain, uh, you know, of manufacturing of communist China, and you will indulge in strategies like nearshoring, friendshoring, and self-shoring, i.e., transferring back the manufacturing units away from China into your friendly countries or neighboring countries or within the country itself. So that why that is being done? In order to protect, in order to insulate US economy and European economies from Chinese predatory practices. So if United States is not following sound fiscal conservative principles, it behooves other countries to modify their economies and de-risk them from the pernicious influence of the United States economy.
So could this unprecedented debt level threaten the US dollar dominance in global trade? And what alternatives could emerge in the global financial system?
We are already seeing that happening because of various reasons, not only just the high US debt, but also issues like unilateral financial sanctions by United States on other countries.
Yeah.
It's leading to a situation that most of the countries are disinvesting in US dollar, in US government treasury bonds, and trying to diversify into other uh, international currencies, other global currencies, investing into euros or yen, etc. But also there is a tendency by national reserve banks to be investing into gold. And you have seen that both China and India have been on gold buying spree. And in fact, India is moving gold from Bank of England vaults to Reserve Bank vaults in Mumbai and Nagpur. So all these things are done because, you know, US dollar is not a stable global currency at this point in time. There are major problems, and other countries will have to take decisions that are more appropriate to protecting their own economies from the effect of US dollar, because US dollar is likely to lose its value. So it does not make sense for other countries to keep investing in US dollars and gradually disinvestment from US government treasury bonds into other options.
So what challenges might developing countries face due to the increase in US debt, such as currency depreciation, inflation, or restricted access to capital markets? So what are the problems you see for the developing countries?
See, again, because developing countries use US dollar as a global currency for trade and all, any change in value of US dollar, if US dollar loses its value, it affects the trade practices.
Hmm.
You know? So it is going to affect one way or the other. I already told you that when US had a banking crisis in 2008, 2009, it affected the currencies of Southeast Asian countries. Their currencies collapsed, and China actually gave them loans to stabilize the currencies. Now, under the BRICS mechanism, there is this new development bank that was created, but also a currency support system was created with almost with a contingency fund of 100 billion US dollars by BRICS for currency support and all. So yes, anything that happens to dollar, other countries and their trade status and their national currencies are likely to be affected by that. And parallel institutions, not necessarily very established institutions, will have to take up the slack.
Okay, moving to my final questions. How should global institutions like IMF or World Bank respond to mitigate the potential ripple effects of the US fiscal policy on vulnerable economies.
So issue is that these two institutions are the Bretton Woods institutions. They are essentially governed by the US. So they have a limited role, but alternative institutions are emerging. I mentioned the New Development Bank
Yeah,
of BRICS or the currency swap mechanism. So, I mean, can IMF dictate fiscal policies to Federal Reserve in US? I mean, IMF has a lot of leverage to dictate fiscal policies to global South countries whenever they need actually some help.
yeah,
That is where its leverage is because they sort of, lend money for the stabilization of economies. And the same thing with World Bank, they put conditionalities. But do they have power to put such conditionalities on US economy or United States Federal Reserve Bank? The answer is no. So it's a very interesting situation. And my guess is that alternative mechanisms have started to spring up, whether that is, from BRICS or G20. So as the economies of other major nations, G20 nations, disproportionately become bigger compared to US economy, there will be changes in the international financial system, and you will see alternative mechanisms, alternative global currencies. I'm not going to predict which one will become, but you will have a basket of currencies so that global hegemony, fiscal hegemony of dollar is not to the extent. And ultimately, it is for countries in the global south to start actually insulating their economies from US economy and not rely just on the US economy for trade and other things.
so how long this ripple effect will last? Do you have any idea?
I don't have a crystal ball. Guess is that US debt, national debt is going to go more than $60 trillion. How soon that happens? It depends upon the policies of the successive US administrations. But I can tell you, uh, the incoming administration is talking a lot about cutting wasteful spending and all that sort of thing. But ironically, the incoming administration headed by Donald Trump, the past record in 4 years of first term was that there was national debt in 4 years period. So that does not inspire much confidence. So it is anybody's guess, but unless US politicians, US bureaucrats return back to balanced budgeting and fiscal conservatism, restrain the unrestrained entitlements and spending, uh, this situation will continue. There were some, efforts at one point in time, 10% across the board, reduction in spending across all the departments as a part of efforts to balance the budget, but those efforts were rather unpopular. But I don't see any other way to restrain spending in US except for across the board where everyone chips in and look at systematic waste of fiscal resources in each system because there's a lot of waste. There are federal governments, there are 800 federal governments which are empty. And still you have to do maintenance of those buildings, you have to heat them, you have to provide electricity, you have to, why can't the federal government sell those buildings, to private sector? So there are issues that pertain to how various successive administrations have dealt with. Certainly, you don't have to, engage in unnecessary wars. The war in Ukraine has drained the U.S. taxpayer resources more than $300 billion over the last 2 years. So, what was the need to put all that money into Ukraine,
Yeah.
the war, which does not make sense? So, it's a complex situation. People sitting outside cannot do anything. It is the US bureaucrats and US politicians who owe it to themselves. Otherwise, they are transferring this debt to the future US generations.
People can only laugh at it, but the main problem, the other developing countries who have done nothing, they will be suffering actually. Some kind of harmful effects will be there.
Yes, they will be there, but you have to insulate your economy. You have to start de-risking your economy from dollar's global hegemony.
So that was all the question I had for today's session. So thank you friends for joining us in exploring the staggering growth of the US national debt. I'm sorry, and its far-reaching consequences. The question remains, is the global economy ready for a potential shift in the financial power balance? We would love to hear your thought. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more insights on the world economy and developing nations challenge. Together, let's stay informed and prepared. Thank you, Dr. Adityanjee. Thank you so much for your valuable time. It was
Thank you, Mr. Sinha, for inviting me on your platform. It's always a pleasure. And let's hope that US government will take some corrective remedial actions to restrain spending
yeah,
and generate more revenue to sustain the US economy.
yes, you are. Thank you so